What we eat isn't just about hunger, it's about history. A family crosses continents with a recipe box and a stubborn sense of flavor. A chef pulls back the curtain on a cutthroat kitchen. And a grain of salt becomes the key to understanding the rise and fall of empires. In this episode, we explore how food connects and divides us, and the invisible forces shaping what ends up on our plates. Welcome to Gateway Books by Crestance, where we explore the space between story and history and the deeper questions that rise from both. I'm your host, Cindy Cruz, and in this episode, we're turning our attention to something we often take for granted: food. Not just what we eat, but how taste is shaped by culture, by class, by colonization, by memory. Across today's three books, we follow flavor as it travels, across borders, across generations, and across the invisible lines between survival and joy. We begin with The 100-Foot Journey by Richard Morais, a novel that walks the line between fable and realism, as a young boy's passion for food leads him from a kitchen in India to the icy front steps of a French village steeped in culinary tradition. It's a story of reinvention, resistance, and the quiet power of migration through the language of spice. Then we move to Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain, a memory that strips the polish off the plate and takes us behind the scenes into the chaos, obsession, and brutal honesty of restaurant life. With Bourdain as our guide, food becomes less about comfort and more about grit, the risk and rhythm behind the dish. And finally, we pull back even further with Salt, A World History by Mark Kurlansky, a sweeping nonfiction journey that traces the role of salt in shaping empires, economies, and the entire food system. Before there was cuisine, before there were chefs, there was preservation, there was survival, there was salt. Taken together, these books show us that taste is never just about pleasure. It's about legacy, labor, identity. And if that kind of reflection speaks to you, if you love stories that dig deep and stay with you, I invite you to explore more at crestance.com. You'll find thoughtful pieces, literary tools, and ways to carry these stories beyond the page. Now let's begin. At first glance, The 100-Foot Journey feels like a story about food. A boy grows up above a restaurant in Mumbai, learns to cook in the chaos of a family kitchen, and he's eventually launched into the rarefied world of French haute cuisine. There are markets, street vendors, the crackle of oil, and the shimmer of clarified butter. But beneath the flavor and the color, this is a story about borders and what it means to cross them. The journey begins with Hassan Haji, whose early life is defined by sensory abundance and family togetherness. His grandfather runs a once glorious restaurant in Bombay, and his father carried the family's culinary passion forward, not with polish or pedigree, but with guts and gusto. Food in this early world is community. It is improvisation. It is loud, fragrant, and shared. When tragedy strikes, an act of violence tied to sectarian unrest, the Haji family is forced to leave India behind. Their path winds through London and eventually brings them to a sleepy village in the French Alps. There, in a stone building across the street from a Michelin-starred French restaurant, they open up a new kitchen. Bold, unfamiliar, and unapologetically Indian. This is where the 100-Foot Journey begins. Not the physical distance between the two buildings, but the vast cultural, emotional, and ideological distance between them. On one side, Madame Mallory, a perfectionist and a traditionalist with decades of culinary discipline behind her. On the other, the Haji family, bringing spice and spontaneity to a town unaccustomed to either. At the heart of the novel is not just a rivalry, but a kind of culinary Cold War. Madame Mallory is horrified by the arrival of the Haji family and their restaurant. To her, they are interlopers, too noisy, too colorful, too crude. Her food is defined by precision, legacy, and French tradition. Theirs is a riot of spices and instinct, with no allegiance to the Escoffier code. The clash is immediate and deeply symbolic. It's not just about competition, it's about cultural legitimacy. Madame Mallory sees herself as the guardian of culinary heritage, and the Haji family, with their cumin and cardamom, Their bright signage and Bollywood soundtrack threatens the sanctity of her domain. Her resistance is brutal. She reports them to the authorities, interferes with their permits, and in a particularly harsh act, even sabotages the restaurant. The community, too, is uneasy. Racism simmers just below the surface. The town's discomfort with the Haji family isn't just about food. It's about difference, about who belongs and who doesn't. But here's where the story begins to stretch beyond caricature. Because Madame Mallory, for all her rigidity, is not entirely immune to talent. She begins to notice Hassan, not just as a rival, but as someone with an intuitive palate, a refined sense of balance, and the potential to be extraordinary. And Hassan, for his part, sees past Madame Mallory's coldness. He recognizes the power of her training and the depth of her discipline, and despite her hostility, he wants to learn. What unfolds is not a simple reconciliation, but a slow, burning evolution, in both the characters and the cuisine. This is where the novel begins to ask bigger questions. Can tradition and innovation coexist? Can identity survive assimilation? And what does it mean to master a craft rooted in someone else's culture? As the tension softens, something more delicate begins to unfold. Not just a blending, so much as a rebalancing. Hassan leaves the family restaurant and apprentices under Madame Mallory, entering a world of rigor and refinement. His knives are sharpened, his instincts honed. He learns to julienne with precision, to plate with restraint, to speak the language of French haute cuisine. But even as he masters this new world, he does not forget his own. The coriander, the ghee, the slow-cooked layers of masala. They remain with him, not as novelties, but as foundations. This is not assimilation in the way we usually mean it. Hassan does not shed one identity to claim another. Instead, he expands. His cooking becomes a dialogue. French in form, Indian in soul. His story resists the binary East versus West and lands instead in a space of creative tension, where flavor becomes a kind of diplomacy. And that's the part that makes the 100-Foot Journey such a compelling, if subtle, exploration of cultural power. It's not just a feel-good tale about learning to get along. It's a meditation on how culture is transferred, altered, and sometimes claimed. Even the novel's title invites this reflection. The journey is not just Hassan's. It's the distance between perspectives, between authenticity and adaptation, between tradition and invention. It's worth noting that the 100-Foot Journey does not fall neatly into the category of historical fiction. The timeline is loosely contemporary, and while global events form the backdrop, they aren't the driving force. But what it does offer, in rich, layered detail, is a portrait of migration, cultural exchange, and the long echoes of colonial legacies. In that sense, it opens the door to real histories, even if it doesn't set out to reenact them. And it does so with warmth, sensory richness, and just enough bite to leave something lasting behind. Before he became a global icon, before the travel shows, the voiceovers, the myth, Anthony Bourdain was a line cook with a chip on his shoulder and a story to tell. Kitchen Confidential, published in 2000, wasn't supposed to launch a career. It was sharp, brash, and unfiltered. Part confession, part expose, a part love letter to a world most readers had never really seen. What he offered wasn't just culinary gossip. It was cultural anthropology, laced with profanity, swagger, and bruised honesty. He wrote about restaurant kitchens not as sacred spaces of artistry, but as chaotic battlegrounds where the unpolished, the unschooled, and the unfiltered lived on cigarettes, speed, and adrenaline. To Bourdain, being a cook wasn't just a job. It was a calling, and it was war. His writing peeled back every pristine image the food world had tried to cultivate. You might walk into a white linen dining room and see elegance and calm, but behind the swinging doors, sharp knives, shouting, sweat, burns, jokes in 5 languages, and a rawness that no menu ever showed. Bourdain told you when not to order fish. He explained why brunch was often where old ingredients went to die. He offered warnings about the cleanliness of kitchens and the hierarchy of respect among cooks. But more than that, He introduced the people most eaters never noticed. The ones who chopped onions until their fingers bled, who cleaned grease traps at 2 a.m., who caught a ride on a prep table from one low-paying gig to the next. What made Kitchen Confidential such a phenomenon wasn't just its brutal honesty. It was the fact that Bourdain refused to romanticize his world, even as he showed deep affection for it. There was no polished sheen, no celebrity chef fantasy. He wrote about restaurants the way a seasoned soldier might write about war, with dark humor, deep loyalty, and the full knowledge of what it cost to survive in that space. And yet, despite the grit, there's reverence in his voice. Not for the industry's false glamour, but for the people who made the impossible happen every night. The undocumented dishwasher working 2 jobs, the prep cook with a prison record and perfect knife skills, the sous chef who never went to culinary school but could break down a whole fish blindfolded. Bourdain's kitchens were filled with outsiders, immigrants, misfits, addicts, artists, people who didn't fit elsewhere, but who found in the clatter and heat of the line a kind of rhythm, a strange, dysfunctional family. By the time the book was released, the food world was beginning to shift. Chefs were gaining visibility, but the conversations around labor, race, and inequality were still muted. Kitchen Confidential cracked that door open. It didn't offer policy. It didn't try to fix the system, but it made it impossible to look at a restaurant and not wonder, who is cooking your food? Who is cleaning up after you? And what did it take for that plate to reach your table? In that sense, Bourdain was more than a writer. He was a translator, turning the chaos of the kitchen into something readers could not only understand, but respect. And as his career expanded, he carried that sensibility with him. His later works on No Reservations and Parts Unknown took that same raw curiosity global, using food as a way to ask deeper questions about culture, memory, and power. But it all started here, in this book, where he introduced himself not as a star, but as a cook. A flawed, fiercely loyal, deeply human one. More than 2 decades after its release, Kitchen Confidential still feels alive, partly because the restaurant world it exposed hasn't changed as much as we'd like to think. The grueling hours, the razor-thin margins, the unspoken hierarchies, they're still there. So are the power imbalances between front-of-house glamour and back-of-house grit. But what has changed is the conversation. Bourdain made it personal. After him, readers started to look beyond the dish. Food became about more than taste. It became a window into culture, labor, and survival. A way to tell stories that weren't being told. He also changed what it meant to be a food writer. Before Kitchen Confidential, writing about food often meant offering recipes or reviews. After Bourdain, it meant peeling back layers, asking who benefits, who gets erased, and who decides what counts as good taste. And he made it okay to love food without pretension, to hold a roadside taco and a truffled amuse-bouche in the same regard, not because they were equal in price or presentation, but because they told you something real about where they came from. That's the gift Bourdain left us, not just an exposé of kitchen life, but a challenge to look deeper, to see every meal not just as consumption, but as a chain of decisions, sacrifices, and stories. In a world that still tends to praise the plate while ignoring the hands that prepared it, Kitchen Confidential is more than a memoir. It's a reminder. Behind every bite, there's a human being, and they have a story worth listening to. In the 100-foot journey, the joy of food is layered with history, migration, reinvention, and the quiet power of fusion. In Kitchen Confidential, that joy is sharpened by grit, the rough-edged truth of kitchens, and the raw force of obsession. With Salt, A World History, Mark Kurlansky steps back even further. He reminds us that before there was cuisine, before there were chefs and critics, there was survival. There was preservation. There was salt. Salt isn't just a seasoning. It's a story. Long, global, and often invisible. And if Bourdain exposed the engine room of the modern kitchen, Kurlansky shows the foundation it rests on. Because this most ordinary of substances, the one that slips through our fingers without a thought, once shaped the borders of empires and the paths of trade routes and the structure of societies. Entire civilizations rose and thrived because they could harness salt. and others declined when they lost control of it. Kurlansky begins with the earliest records of salt extraction in ancient China. For thousands of years, the Chinese were drilling brine wells with bamboo piping, engineering marvels centuries ahead of their time. The salt they harvested wasn't just for seasoning, it was essential to survival. Governments formed around it, taxes were levied on it, and revolts rose in response. Salt paid for bureaucracies, armies, dynasties. The Romans built roads to move it. Soldiers were paid in it. The word salary itself comes from salarium, the allowance given for salt. And across Europe, salt became a symbol of status. To be seated above the salt at a banquet meant you were of higher rank. Below it, you were merely tolerated. But when something becomes essential, it also becomes a weapon. In 18th century France, the gabelle, a salt tax that fell heavily on the poor, stroked resentment that fed the French Revolution. And in 20th century India, Gandhi chose salt to challenge the British imperial rule. He knew its power. The Salt March was simple. Walk to the sea and gather what should never have been taxed. But it struck at the heart of colonial control, using something humble to call out something immense. That's what Kurlansky does best. He shows how something so small, a crystal, a grain, can carry the weight of empire. Salt is not a linear history, but a sweeping one, moving across time and geography with ease. From the salt pans of Senegal to the pink lakes of Bolivia, from Viking trade routes to Appalachian saltworks, every page offers a reminder that food is never just food. It is economy. It is labor. It is belief. In Iceland, salt preserved fish through long, dark winters. In Japan, it was and still is used in purification rituals, tossed to cleanse spaces and ward off misfortune. In Ethiopia, salt blocks were currency. In West Africa, they were worth their weight in gold. In the American South, salt was critical to curing meat, and enslaved labor was often forced into brutal salt mining operations to meet demand. Kurlansky doesn't romanticize any of it. He honors the ingenuity, but doesn't flinch from the cost. Salt created systems of power, but also systems of exploitation. Control over salt meant control over life, so it was taxed, hoarded, traded, and fought over. It built wealth for some and destroyed health and liberty for others. And then, almost without notice, the world changed. Industrialization made salt abundant, cheap, ordinary. The thing that once sparked revolution now comes free with fast food. It's poured without ceremony, hidden in snacks, dissolved into foods that are barely foods at all. But something else changed too, the way we think about taste. The earlier books in this episode each speak to that evolution. The 100-Foot Journey shows how cuisine became a bridge, across borders, across trauma. Kitchen Confidential gives us the inside edge of that evolution, the harshness, but also the artistry of those who make meals into identity. And Salt reminds us that long before identity, there was necessity. The ancient world didn't talk about flavor profiles. Salt wasn't a finishing touch. It was a force. It drew out moisture, enabled fermentation, allowed meat and fish to survive the seasons. It was practical, unforgiving, a kind of preservation technology in mineral form. And yet, Kurlansky also reminds us that salt is, in its own way, beautiful. It links us across continents, across generations, across every meal ever cooked with care. Even today, traditional salt harvesting survives in corners of the world. Women in Senegal harvesting crystals by hand. Japanese artisans preparing seawater in a slow ritual. Chefs experimenting with flake, smoke, and sea. These practices are not nostalgia, they're knowledge. They are reminders of the long relationship between food and place, labor and land. Kurlansky also connects salt to storytelling because food, after all, is memory. A preserved herring is not just a dish, it's a history, a lineage, a survival strategy passed from hands that knew hunger. A country ham, dry cured and hung, tells the story of rural economies and the skills that rose to meet need. Kimchi, anchovies, sauerkraut, feta, pickles, olives. These aren't just tastes, they're technologies. Salt is what made them possible, and salt is what carried them forward. In a world that prizes novelty, new flavors, new trends, new ways of eating, salt asks us to look backwards, not to dwell, but to understand. Because before we can understand what we eat or why we crave certain tastes, we have to understand what food has meant. And it has meant endurance, innovation, resistance. Salt ties all of this together. It's the link between empire and appetite, between hardship and heritage, between power and plate. And that's why this book belongs in this episode. It completes the arc. Where the Hundredfoot Journey celebrates fusion and Kitchen Confidential demystifies the kitchen, salt reminds us of the cost and the legacy of flavor itself. So the next time you reach for salt, pause. In your hands is not just a mineral. It's a map, a memory, a thread connecting you to those who came before, those who marched for it, mined it, taxed it, traded it, those who preserved what they loved, and those who passed it down grain by grain. Behind every recipe is a journey. Some are measured in spices and sauces, others in scars and survival. In the Hundredfoot Journey, we saw how food becomes a bridge, not just between cultures, but between past and present, grief and growth. It's a story of how flavor can carry longing, and how the act of cooking can become a kind of healing. But food, as Hassan's family learns, is never just about taste. It's about belonging, or the search for it. Then came Kitchen Confidential, and with it, the myth of the perfect dish shattered. Bourdain pulled back the curtain to reveal the heat, the labor, the edge of chaos rhythm between the scenes. He showed us that before food becomes an experience, it's a battle. One that many cooks fight daily, quietly, under fluorescent lights and relentless pressure. And in Salt, we pulled back the camera even further. We looked at the mineral itself, the one that seasons every cuisine, the one that once determined the fates of empires. Salt wasn't chosen for flavor, it was chosen for survival. Before the restaurants, before fusion or fine dining, salt was how we kept food and culture alive. Each book, on its own way, reminds us that food is not just about pleasure. It's about history. It's about work. It's about the forces, personal and political, that shape what ends up in our plates. So the next time we taste something and find it just right, let's pause. Let's remember the long chain of hands and histories that made it possible. The migrations and markets, the sweat and spark, the salt beneath it all. Because to eat, thoughtfully, gratefully, is to acknowledge that we are part of something bigger. We don't just consume food, we inherit it. Thank you for spending time with me, for traveling across kitchens, histories, and memories through the lens of story. Whether it was the scent of spice in the Hundredfoot Journey, the raw heat of Kitchen Confidential, or the quiet persistence of salt, I hope something in this episode stayed with you, and maybe even changed how you taste the world around you. If you'd like to carry that spirit forward, I invite you to visit Crestance.com, a space created for thoughtful readers, curious minds, and those who believe stories still matter. Your support there and here is what keeps Crestance going, and I am deeply grateful for it. If you enjoyed this episode, help us grow by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts on the comments. Until next time, keep reading boldly, thinking deeply, and may your next story rise like something slow simmered, rich with memory and made to be shared.